Taking fights is one of the essential ways of progressing in a single match of Deadlock, and well, this certainly is true. And a lot of people come to me with this question both on my Twitch and in my YouTube comments, and that's of when, where, and how do I take a fight, and that's exactly what we'll be answering in today's video. Let's first tackle our first question with when do you take a fight, and when do you avoid a fight? Now, one of the biggest mistakes I see that newer Deadlock players make, even Deadlock players that have been playing for quite a while, they have a thinking that if I see enemies, I should fight. And honestly, that mindset is what loses games. See, in Deadlock, fights are not the true objective. Fights are the tool that lets you take the objectives. Now, the best teams don't randomly brawl non-stop. They fight with a purpose, whether it's mid-boss, walkers, soul earn, lane pressure, map control, or even ending the game. If a fight does not lead to something valuable, a lot of the time it's just wasted tempo. Then what are good fights and what are some bad fights? Well, good fights are fights that secure objectives, create some sort of map pressure, deny enemy farm, open up the map, convert into towers or walkers, get to the mid-boss, and lets you take the earn safely. These fights typically will result into you winning the game. Then what are bad fights? Well, bad fights are random scrimmages in the jungle, chasing kills across the map, finding under enemy walkers, forcing 4v6s, fighting while behind in souls, contesting nothing. Even if you win these fights, you often gain almost nothing. Meanwhile, lanes crashes into your structure, so whether it's your guardians or walkers, enemies respawn, so they have a closer respawn and you'll just lose the fight if it's prolonged. Then you lose farm efficiency, and your map state gets worse. That's why sometimes high-level Deadlock feels a little bit slower sometimes, because good players are constantly asking, what do we gain if we win this fight? If the answer is nothing, then they won't take it. Now, you've probably heard this time and time again, but because of this, when, objectives are what create winning positions. So mid-boss is the most important fight trigger. The mid-boss completely changes the game, especially around the 19 to 20 minutes the mid to late game after major picks, after enemy ults are burned, and that is why. Because mid-boss gives you huge soul swings, map control, pressure, momentum, siege potential, and comeback denial. This means if mid-boss is spawning soon, everything changes. Now, before mid-boss spawns, good teams start pushing side lanes, establishing vision or control, like knowing where routes are, where people are, etc., grouping early, looking for picks, forcing enemies to show on the map, because if one enemy dies before mid-boss, that can instantly become a free boss, a free walker, a free base pressure, or a free base push altogether, and one pick can lose the entire game late. That's how important objectives become. Then you come to fighting around walkers. Walkers are massive map control checkpoints, essentially. Taking a walker opens the map, creates safer farming routes, gives zipline pressure, removes enemy safety nets, and increases lane pressure, as well as giving you that extra value flex slot. This means fights around walkers are extremely valuable, but there's an important distinction. Fighting for a walker is good. Fighting under an enemy walker is usually terrible. Why? Because defenders have the advantage of the walker. Sure, it doesn't do an insane amount of damage, it's still an extra damage with the possibility of chain CCing you or leading into a continuous crowd control threshold. Moving on, we have the soul earn, which is another when idea. So the earn isn't just a pickup objective, it forces teams to rotate, fight in awkward terrain, control pathways, manage timing, and pressure side lanes. Good teams understand the earn fight often starts before the earn is actually touched. How? By shoving lanes first, forcing enemies to reveal themselves, creating numbers advantage, baiting cooldowns, and forcing bad rotations. If enemies are clearing a massive side wave, they may arrive late. That creates temporary 6v5s, positioning advantages, and free setup space. This is why lane pressure matters so much before objectives. Now, numbers advantage is always a thing in a lot of different games, tag shooters, hero shooters, whatever the case may be, where a 6v6 is, risky because it's even odds. If someone is a little bit stronger than the other, it usually results in that side winning. A 6v5, however, is the fight becomes heavily favored to one side. A 6v4, that's usually game winning, and for the most part in high elo Deadlock, it's often less about necessary mechanics, although it is still a major impactful part of the game fundamentally, but it's more about creating uneven fights. If you can somehow deathball maybe as 6 to get a jump on 2 or 3 players, usually you're going to be winning that engagement and coming out on top. Now you're fighting a 6v3, a 6v4, and so on. Now, how do good teams create numbers advantages? Well, that's done by getting picks. If you kill one enemy, it forces objectives immediately, it pressures the mid-boss, you push walkers, invade the jungle, and you don't waste time resetting. Respawn timers become incredibly punishing later on. You have to take, for instance, if a timer like mid-boss is about to come up, let's say you already took a mid-boss fight before, but you're like 2 seconds off before mid-boss respawning or 10 seconds off. You want to do your best to try to take a 6v6 or a 6v5 fight. You don't want to have one of your teammates sidelaning when mid-boss is about to come up, because you might be losing a major team fight and losing the mid-boss and throwing that away for free. That's why when understanding the timers is such a crucial aspect, because one death can mean a boss, multiple walkers, base guardians, and game-ending pressure. Now, if you haven't done so already, I highly encourage you to check out my laning guide video that I posted a couple weeks back. And this is because of forcing enemy rotations. Now, if one of your side lanes or even your mid lane is shoved hard, someone from the enemy team must answer it. That temporarily creates a 6v5 elsewhere. You have slower enemy setups, split map pressure, and this is why macro, for the most part, will win games. Yes, your mechanical skill can carry you throughout multiple ranks, but macro ultimately is a major aspect that I think a lot of people don't really take into consideration. Just because you can out-aim me doesn't necessarily you're going to win the game because I can out-macro you. For the most part, MOBAs are typically, I would say, maybe 80% understanding the map and knowledge of the game, and 20% of mechanical skill, where definitely movement is probably the hardest aspect of this game, but that's just my own general opinion. I think another massive aspect of when do you take fights is when you're behind. This is where smart teams stop ego fighting. If you're behind, you don't necessarily want to force random 6v6s. Why? Because enemy item leads matter massively in Deadlock. If you're down souls, ultimate, map control, structures, then straight up fighting usually doesn't favor yourself. So what exactly should you do instead? Farm, catch waves, take jungle, scale safely, and push side lanes. You want to force enemies to respawn. This creates split pressure, delayed rotations, and possible numbers advantage. You want to look for picks. You don't necessarily want to win a full 6v6. Sometimes one isolated kill is enough to secure their urn, stop the mid-boss, or reclaim some of the map control. And you also, in this state of mind, want to be fighting on your own terms. You want to fight near your structures with better positioning, around cooldown advantages after enemy mistakes, not because you necessarily saw a Mina or you saw a holiday running around the map. And I think another big thing is how lanes win games. One of the most important concepts in Deadlock, if there's no critical objective spotting, no guaranteed advantageous fight, you should probably be farming, pushing waves, damaging structures, fixing lane pressure. Why? Because lanes create map pressure. They create information so you can see enemies on the map. They have rotation stress, so the enemies are stressing where to rotate, and it somewhat gives you some objective control. If you're going for an urn and you're shoving the green wave and you have prio on that wave, it's a safer dunk because it takes longer for the enemies to reach towards you. And a team with shoved lanes controls the pace of the game. A team constantly clearing wave defensively usually loses map control. Now, I think the last concept for our win condition, get it? It's a pun, never mind, is the post-fight macro is what separates good players. Winning the fight is only half the job. The real question is, what do we take after? Well, after winning said fight, you want to think about taking mid-boss, taking walkers, evading jungles, stealing camps, pushing lane, securing the urn, establishing some sort of map control, and bad teams would often win a fight, then recall immediately going back to their own patron. And honestly, good teams convert the fight into permanent advantages, whether it's taking the center sacrifices, buffs on the side of the map at the 5-minute timers, or taking the urn or doing anything else of the sort. And that's your win. If you're finding this video helpful in any way, shape, or form so far, do me a favor, make sure to hit the like button. But anyways, on to our wear condition. Now, when it comes to wear, in my eyes, I think there's a lot of ways to explain it, but I think for the sake of how I picture it, it's where are you taking the fight? I think where you're taking the fight depends on a couple conditions. The first condition being, what is your team composition? For example, do you have a Lash? If you have a Lash, you should probably be fighting in the open so that Lash can use his Death Slam ultimate and actually get some value, instead of fighting inside of a small room like inside of the nursery or inside of those tier 1 jungle camps, you want to do it where you have the advantage with said characters. Or for instance, do you have a dynamo on your team? If you have a dynamo, you should probably be looking to fight in pretty close spaces, whether that's inside of the mid-boss pit or inside of hallways or anything of the sort. Now, I think another big thing about where is positioning, and I think positioning is a major factor when you're trying to look for fights. Now, I'm not amazing at editing, so we're going to be using lockblaze.com to kind of show you what I mean about positioning. Now, the interesting thing about Deadlock is that the characters don't necessarily have a true role. Yeah, some characters might be stronger in certain ways, whether it's a rem. Probably it's in your best interest to build support, unless you want to play gun rem. But there's some characters that prioritize that kind of lean towards certain roles, and because of that, you have to position wisely. So for example, you have your frontliners, some of the more tankier characters that can stay in the front line and have certain useful abilities. These are characters like Abrams or anything else like that. So if you're trying to position correctly, you would think you want your Abrams in the front. You would want, your carry between your front and between your backline. Your backline could, in theory, be a character that is just supporting. So for instance, like a page. Your page would be your backline. I could fight her on this sheet. So your page would be your backline, let's just say here. And your carry, for example, let's say Ven, would probably be in between these two. Why are we positioned this way? Well, you have your Abrams, he's the front line. He's trying to protect your Venator from getting jumped. And your Venator is trying to protect your support. Because in theory, the longer your support is alive, means the more shielding, healing, and potential to swing the fight in your favor is going to be for yourself. The second you lose your support, fights become less favorable for you. Even, yes, it is like a 6v5, for example, but you don't have that extra shielding to try to protect you. You don't have that healing. You don't have the stuns, the roots to try to catch enemies. The second this character is a waste, which is your backline, fights become much harder. If, for example, maybe your frontline dies, but you still have your carry, your carries, or your support players alive with those two, even if Abrams in quotation dies, you could still probably turn the fight because you have those two aspects to try to carry you out, depending on how strong they are. But in instances like this, understanding how to position is usually the most idea. And for example, if you're playing like a pick character, like Paradox, like Bebop, or any of the others, these are the characters that kind of want to off angle. These are the characters that are looking for side picks, trying to go for enemies that are kind of out of position or anything of this sort. So for instance, if you had, I don't know, let's say like a Talon or something here, you would want to try to pick him on Bebop, but you don't want to necessarily be going from the same exact angle as your other frontliners, because he's going to be able to understand that, oh, this guy is probably looking to hook me. So using a character like Bebop or some type of pick character like Lash or Paradox, trying to take an off angle to try to get the jump on somebody is usually the best practice and most common idea. Like I was saying earlier, if you're fighting in tight corridors or anything of the sort, characters like Dynamo is your best option because you're looking for those sort of fights when you have this sort of team composition. If you have a Dynamo, you want to be looking in small areas. If you have a Lash, you want to be playing in the open so you can use his ultimate. If you have a 7, you want to be playing in the open for the most part. If you're having a pocket, you kind of want to play in tight, closed spaces as well to get maximum affliction value. If you're playing with a Shiv, you're trying to force fights in hallways or anything of the sort so you can get maximum dash value. And the list goes on and on, but that's essentially where do you take fights is all reliant on your team composition. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of a better understanding. I tried my best, but yeah, this is kind of what I envision. I wish I was better at editing so I could show you what everything else, but this is kind of what I'm looking at. Lastly, we have how, and it's essentially how do you take a fight? How do you position, as it kind of ties in with the last topic of where. But I think I want to stick to how do you take a fight is probably the better idea. Knowing how to take the fight is what separates decent players from players that constantly win games. A lot of teams will lose fights before the abilities even start flying because they walk in lane, enter from bad angles, fight split, engage without cooldowns, don't push lanes first or run straight through obvious choke points, so good fights are usually won before the first kill happens. Now, just like other games, for example Marvel Rivals, Overwatch, or anything of the sort, one of the biggest reasons teams lose is because they trickle into fights one by one. Deadlock punishes split entries relatively hard. If your tank enters early, for example like Abrams, this is just hypothetically, and then your support like Paige, Rem, Kelvin, whatever the case may be, arrives 5 seconds later, the carry is still farming the jungle, the fight is already losing even if your team is technically there. Because good teams synchronize their entry timing. And you can see this time and time again when enemies or teammates slowly trickle in one by one when the fight's starting. You have someone all the way on the left side of the map just farming the camps, while you have a 5v6 going down, and then the guy farming on the left side realizes, oh, we're fighting, so they have to come in. But by the time they're already arriving to the fight, you've already lost maybe 1, 2, 3 players, and you being in that fight is no longer impactful because the fight's over. So when you get to a certain point into the game, at 41 souls, I would say, because that's your max AP, this is when you just want to always try to deathball, especially when there's big timers on the map and you know a lot of your team is strong or you have an advantage. Trying to deathball together is probably a good idea. Deathballing it's an annoying strategy, but it's honestly one of the best ways to go about doing anything in this game for the most part right now, but eventually maybe this will change. Now, I think another big factor a lot of people kind of don't realize or really think about too much is grouping, and that doesn't necessarily mean stacking. This is important because you want to arrive together, but you do not want to stand on top of one another, especially if there's like an enemy dynamo or anything of this sort that will just have a super big impact from all of you sitting on top of one another. Because you have AoE ultimates, chain, crowd control, splash damage, zoning tools, which can instantly destroy group teammates. Good positioning means close enough to assist, but far enough to avoid multi-man punishment. It's like you're at your prom, your school dance, and you're trying to save some room for Jesus for your dance. You kind of get the idea. And I think another big thing a lot of people don't necessarily understand is trying to look for different angles to a fight. The easiest fights in Deadlock happens when enemies are forced to look in multiple directions. It's a chaotic fight, people going all over the place, and if all 6 players run through one doorway, one hallway, especially against a Shiv, well, the enemy team gets easy poke, easy ultimates, easy crowd control, protectable in cages. Instead, you want to be thinking about how to pressure from different angles. This is why different team compositions really excel, and just attacking from one side is probably not the best idea. It's kind of like other games when you have a flanking character that can kind of pull the attention of the enemies, while the rest of your team can roll the enemy down. I think you have to start thinking about this game in different ways than just one. Now, this next little spiel I think is really good in organized or even pro play, but I think it also can be adapted to your pub or MM matches, because that is identifying the win condition. Every fight should have some sort of goal. Sometimes your win condition is going for the enemy carry right away, or it might be protecting your hyper carry so they can burst down the enemy quicker. Or you want to think about bursting the mid-boss quickly, or maybe you're trying to disengage from the enemy, or you're trying to stall for cooldowns, or you're trying to zone enemies off of objectives. Not every fight is to kill everybody. I mean, you just need to understand what truly matters. If you have a fed Venator on the enemy team, maybe trying to dump all of your resources into getting the jump on him is probably the better idea than just trying to soak up all of the damage, because he would just start destroying you. And I think understanding your win conditions are really good ideas, because, for instance, if you have a Lash, if you have a Dynamo, understanding that those 2 ultimates are your win conditioning and only playing for those is probably a good idea, because if you're trying to play outside of those timers, you might just lose those fights, or you definitely could have won if you had the ultimates ready to go. I think it all depends on timing, and it depends on location as well. Those are big things that I don't think a lot of people truly understand, especially with Dynamo players for the most part. Usually, for some reason, they're off farming to the side for whatever reason when a team fight's going down. And their ultimate can literally make the difference between winning and losing a fight relatively fast. So understanding your win conditions is probably one of the biggest ways of how to win and how to take fights. Now, honestly, even though this game is super chaotic, I think the best fights feel relatively easy. And what I mean by that is that the biggest realization players eventually have is that good fights rarely feel super chaotic. Why? Because they feel prepared. They understand who they're going for. They understand their win conditions. It feels controlled. it feels layered because you have multiple instances and you have multiple ideas. And it feels intentional because you already set up waves to be pushing, you set up certain ideas to be implemented, and because the setup did most of the work, that being map pressure, lane setup, the angles, the cooldown tracking, and of course the numbers advantage in some way, shape, or form. And this is honestly what, when, and how to win fights in Deadlock. And like I said, if this video has helped you in any way, shape, or form, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments down below what else you would like to see. But I hope you have a great and safe day, and I'll catch you in the next one.